Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Over the Edge of the World. I'm Jamie Polya. For nearly 4 decades, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you live public discussions of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. The historical ramifications of Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe in the 16th century are difficult to exaggerate. He set out to accomplish what Columbus never could, reach the east by sailing west. Leaving Spain, his fleet of 5 ships traveled over 41,000 miles and was at sea for more than 3 years before one lone vessel finally completed the journey home. The men endured monster storms, mutiny, torture, and disease. Nearly the entire crew of 250 perished, including Magellan himself. In his new book, Over the Edge of the World, Magellan's Terrifying Circumnavigation of the Globe, our speaker, historian Laurence Bergreen, draws on eyewitness accounts and new archival materials to detail the amazing drama of the most famous sea voyage in history. Laurence Bergreen is the author of numerous biographies, including Louis Armstrong, An Extravagant Life, judged one of the best books of '97, and Capone, The Man and the Era. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Laurence Bergreen.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie, for that very eloquent introduction, and my thanks also to the Cambridge Forum for inviting me to be here tonight in this historic church, past which I walked so many times as an undergraduate in years gone by, and my thanks to you for coming out tonight and joining me here. I'm going to try and take you all around the world, circa 15-20, in about 20 minutes or even less, as the time ticks by, to talk about Ferdinand Magellan and what was really an epical and, as you'll find out, a very, very disastrous voyage as well, one that Magellan did not live to complete. In fact, almost everybody on the voyage died. Of 5 ships and 260 sailors that set out from Seville in 1519. 3 years later, only 1 ship with 18 of the original crew made it back safely. The rest had either mutinied or died or abandoned the expedition somewhere along the way. Nevertheless, the voyage was counted a considerable success, not because of any scientific or geographical discoveries, but because it made a lot of money for its backers. King Charles I of Spain and the financial backers who originally put up the money for the voyage. People often ask me where I got the idea for this trip, for this book, and it actually began on Mars, the planet Mars, with my previous book, Voyage to Mars, which came out in 2000, and I was following the same group of NASA scientists who are conducting many of the experiments that are occurring today on Mars with the 2 rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, looking for signs of water on Mars and indirectly signs of life on Mars. And some of them, especially Jim Garvin, the lead scientist for NASA, were involved in planning NASA's next 25 years. And they often drew analogies in their discussions to the age of exploration in the 16th century. They talked about Christopher Columbus, who was incidentally Magellan's boyhood hero and inspiration. They talked about Balboa and da Gama and all those names we remember from junior high or even earlier. And most of all, they talked about Ferdinand Magellan as their inspiration for their current and future exploration of the solar system, because he provided what they consider to be a model of intelligent exploration. I think, simply put, by that they meant he thought he knew what he was doing, whereas many of the other explorers actually didn't. They were by current standards, I guess, clueless. Even Magellan, by our standards, was woefully ignorant about the nature of the world at large. Most maps of the world that were current were known as T&O maps, and they were based on a rather literal reading of the Bible. They placed all the oceans surrounding the globe. It did seem as if you could sail, if not off the edge of the world, then into endless mists, brumae in the Latin, that appeared on the maps of that era. There were only 3 continents. There was only one ocean, the Ocean Sea, which we know as the Atlantic. Jerusalem was literally at the top of the globe. Hell was somewhere near the bottom. It was, of course, useless for navigation. The most learned cosmologists of the era were relying on the 1,400-year-old mathematical compilations and calculations of Ptolemy, the Greek-Egyptian mathematician who had compiled them and whose work had been rediscovered and reprinted during the Renaissance thanks to the Gutenberg Bible. Ptolemy's map did indeed portray the world as a globe. However, there were some very, very significant problems with it. First of all, China and the East, or Cathay, as it was then known, was pushed right up against the west coast of the South American landmass. There was no Pacific Ocean. So the globe was about 9,000 miles smaller in circumference than it actually is. In fact, the problems, the omissions of Ptolemy were so great that if Magellan and his backers had known how big the globe really was and how daunting the problems of the voyage actually were, I think it's likely that he would never have gone, that they would never have gotten backing, and that they would have considered a circumnavigation suicidal. And in fact, it turned out to be darn near suicidal for almost everybody involved, including Magellan. As I mentioned to you, this was a commercial voyage, and the goal was to get spices from the Spice Islands, which are in Indonesia. 5 very small islands, the best known of which were Ternate and Tidore. And you may well ask, and I did, what's the big deal about spices? Why risk your life to go for some food flavorings? In fact, spices were the most important commodity on the face of the earth at that time. They were roughly analogous to oil in our present day, in the sense that they defined the global economy such as it was. They were also controlled by Arabs in a monopoly that stretched back to biblical times and probably earlier. They had always been synonymous with wealth and luxury, and they were used for medicinal purposes, for aphrodisiacs, as well as embalming, and of course the flavoring and preserving of food. Because they were fairly transportable, they served as a medium of exchange in an economy which relied far more on barter than our own currency-based economy. There was really no such thing in those days as a rate of exchange among countries in Europe and their currencies. And so spices were even more valuable than gold as a medium of commerce. If you were a sailor on a voyage like Magellan's and you managed to bring back even a small sack of gold, that would be enough of spices. That would be enough for you to retire on and live, buy a house, and support your family for the rest of your life. That was all you needed to do. If you were the captain of a voyage like Magellan, you would have wealth beyond imagining. Continents could be named after you. Your name would be recorded in history forever. So the goals, the ambitions of explorers like Magellan were immense. Not only their material goals, but their goals to serve their king, in this case, King Charles. So Magellan really went for both greed and glory. Now, who did he go for? He went for an 18-year-old boy. King Charles had come to Spain 2 years before this. He spoke only Flemish. He drank beer. He was trying to learn Spanish and trying to grow a beard, and he was trying to learn about girls. And he was advised by a much older group of advisors who were telling him what to do. And it was this group to whom Magellan had come and presented a very, very beguiling plan to essentially do an end run around the Arab monopoly of spices. Now, that had been an overland monopoly across the steppes of the East and Eastern Europe, and finally making its way to Europe. Magellan simply proposed going to the east by sailing west, always west, until they got there, and then seizing control of the world's most valuable monopoly. Furthermore, he promised to do it by discovering a darn near mythical passage or shortcut to the east, which today we know as the Strait of Magellan. Now, this was a rumor at most. It existed on some maps, but these maps also contained sea monsters and mermaids and the boiling oceans at the equator and magnetic islands that could pull the nails out of ships and all sorts of other fictitious things that were thought to be perhaps real by the sailors and the cosmologists and the political leaders of the era. So when Magellan presented his plan, which was a very carefully calculated presentation, he knew that exactly how to pitch it to King Charles I and his advisors. Magellan was also a very observant Catholic at a moment when the Protestant Reformation was just about to break out in full cry. In fact, that's exactly what happened when Magellan was at sea. The Pope at that time was the famous, or perhaps notorious, Leo X. If you look in my book, you'll see a famous portrait of Leo X by Raphael, which doesn't show the libertine of popular memory, but rather shows a rather worried and scholarly fellow sitting there, actually seeming to be menaced by two cardinals. And in fact, Pope Leo X lived in an era when cardinals were being poisoned and throttled and were said to be out to kill the Pope. It was a very dangerous time to be in the Vatican, and the amount of corruption and intrigue created this tremendous reaction against the Church. Nevertheless, Magellan himself was a very devout Catholic. He was also somewhat of a questionable commodity in Spain because he was Portuguese. We all know people like Magellan. He was brilliant, and he was also very, very obnoxious. Most of the contemporary accounts that we have of Magellan stress that he was an expert seaman, that he seemed to know more than anybody else about the subject at hand, and that he never tired of reminding everybody around him of that fact. And he could be irritating. His people skills, so-called, were very low or perhaps non-existent. And this is why he could never get backing for this very clever and ambitious voyage in in his native Portugal. In fact, he tried 3 times, and he failed 3 times. And after a while, he gave up and came to Spain and got backing in just a few weeks, in part because he was something of an unknown quantity. Now, this defection was roughly analogous to, say, in the Cold War, a Soviet rocket engineer defecting from the Soviet Union's rocket program to ours. As you can imagine, this person would be viewed with suspicion on both sides. In the Soviet Union, he would be considered a traitor and an unperson. And in this country, everybody would wonder, what's the deal? What's the deal? Why did he do this? Does he have a double agenda? Is he really a secret agent or spy for the Soviets? And these were exactly the questions that were raised about Magellan, both before the voyage and even after he was at sea. And as a direct result of these suspicions about where his allegiances actually lay, to which country, Spain or Portugal, he had to put down no less than 4 major mutinies on the voyage. And they began almost as soon as they left Seville and surfaced again as he was sailing down the eastern coast, along the eastern coast of South America. They grew increasingly violent until Magellan was nearly stabbed in one. And as a result, and this was near the Strait of Magellan, which means it was near the southernmost tip of South America, he actually resorted to torture and execution of the chief malefactors. Now, he was within his rights to do this, and this was, after all, the era of the Spanish Inquisition. Nevertheless, by our standards, he was an exceptionally cruel tyrant. His methods of punishment and torture included drawing and quartering, literally opening the guts of the supposed offender, burning them in front of him, having his limbs and his arms and legs torn off by attaching them to the capstan aboard ship, and the sailors would turn it until they were pulled from his body. Confessions, by the way, in the Inquisition that were obtained this way were considered the most legitimate confessions of all, rather than confessions obtained under duress as we would think of them, and therefore being invalid. When he was done torturing his victims, he had their heads placed on pikes near where the ships were tied up as a warning to the other sailors that this is what would happen to those who dared betray Ferdinand Magellan. This managed to cow most of the men who were serving under him, and they were a mixture of 10 European nationalities, into submission, but not all of them. In fact, in the middle of his most heroic effort during the entire expedition, which was navigating the Strait of Magellan, an entire shipload of men, over 50 of them, turned around under cover of darkness one night and sailed all the way back to Spain. all those, they were in effect mutineers, spread stories about what a horrible person Magellan was, how he was torturing Spanish officers, which was true, although they forgot to mention that these officers had tried to kill Magellan prior to that, and that Magellan was within his legal rights at the time to do so. But of course they were trying to save their own skins. The Spanish authorities didn't know what to make of them, and so they locked them all up, pending further investigation. And they gave very detailed depositions, 55 of them, about the events of the voyage. In fact, there's so much information about this voyage that I was able to uncover in Spanish and Portuguese and in Middle French, that it was possible to recreate it on a day-by-day basis. We have the pilot's logs. We have all those depositions that I mentioned. We have royal documents. Also, we were very unfortunate that Magellan had the foresight to bring along with him a true Renaissance man whose name was Antonio Pigafetta. Pigafetta, kind of a funny name, was a young and very ambitious papal diplomat who had never been to sea. He was in his early 30s, and when he heard that Magellan, when he came to Seville and heard that Magellan was putting together this expedition, he simply presented himself to Magellan and said that he wanted to come along too. He wanted to keep a record of the voyage because, as he later wrote, he wanted to make a great name for himself in history. His role model was that other Venetian traveler, Marco Polo. Fortunately for us, Magellan was among those 18 survivors and wrote an account almost day by day, an anecdotal and non-technical account of what it was like to actually sail on those ships and be on the decks with Magellan. And I drew heavily on this account in my book. It's been around ever since the end of the voyage in a number of different translations. We're not really sure what language Pigafetta wrote it in. It might have been in a Venetian dialect. More likely, it was probably in Middle French, which was one of the two languages of learned discourse, the other one being Latin. In any event, it was censored for many years because it was, by standards, well, certainly by Victorian standards, X-rated, because although he was a very pious individual, Pigafetta did not shirk from writing about the orgies that the men participated in. It was obvious that he was among them and participating in these orgies. Now, there were really two kinds of orgies, it seemed to me, and I'll have to make it short because my time is limited, and this is a subject I could go on about at greater length, and we can get back to it in questions if you like. But there were sort of the standard Hollywood orgies that we've seen where all the young beauties swim out to the ships and could be purchased for whose companionship could be purchased for a hatchet or a comb or a nail or a metal mirror or something like that. And Magellan sailors did indeed participate in orgies like that, especially in Rio de Janeiro, which was their first, or almost their first, landfall in the New World. But after they had successfully navigated the Strait of Magellan and began to navigate the Pacific Ocean, which, by the way, they hadn't known existed, and they began to encounter a number of indigenous peoples on the islands, they also discovered, to their dismay, sexual customs that were unknown to anyone in Europe. And these included a practice that Pigafetta wrote about called palang, which was widespread throughout the Pacific, which involved alteration and stretching of the genitals. Pigafetta gave a very detailed explanation of what it was like to engage in intercourse under these circumstances, in almost excruciating detail, I would add. And it was things like this that were, of course, excised for decades. And it was actually only in 1970 that the first really full and unexpurgated accounts of Pigafetta's, translations of Pigafetta's account began to appear and be available for the general reader. He also wrote about Magellan's reaction to these orgies, which led directly or indirectly to his own death. And since my time is drawing to a close, I'll conclude my remarks with that. Magellan was very concerned about his men's participation in these orgies, whether they involved palang or not. And he was very concerned that this was a mortal sin. Now, he brought along 3 priests with him, And by this point, 2 of the priests were still alive, and they agreed, and they encouraged him to embark on a course of conversion of the indigenous peoples wherever they went. Magellan discovered that most of the islanders were very happy to convert to the god of the Europeans who would come in their big black ships. They were mostly idol worshippers, and it seemed to them that the case was made that the Europeans' god was somehow bigger and more powerful than their own god. After all, the Europeans had guns and gunpowder, which was very loud. Their ships were immense. They had come from a far-off place, and they seemed tremendously powerful, if tremendously clumsy in their eyes. Now, a lot of this is inference on my part when I say in their eyes, because we're talking about pre-literate cultures, and it's one of the limitations of Magellan, despite all the sources that I mentioned, that we only see it through Europe. We only see the expedition through European eyes. We don't really know how he appeared to those people around him, although we can get some inferences. We do know, according to Pigafetta, that he managed to convert over 2,000 islanders with apparent tremendous enthusiasm to Christianity, especially women. The idea was that if the women were at least converts, it would somehow be a lesser sin for the sailors, the European sailors, to participate and to have relations with them. However, there was one holdout. This was one of the chieftains on the island of Mactan in the Philippines. His name was Lapu. We don't really know anything else about him because, again, it's a pre-literate culture. But we do know that Lapu was not going to do what his enemies were doing, that is, converting to Christianity. He was going to do the opposite. And so he defied Magellan. As I mentioned, Magellan was a very stubborn individual. And so he immediately decided he would challenge Lapu to a battle. Magellan was convinced he would win for several reasons. First of all, he believed God was on his side. Secondly, he had metal armor. And third, he had gunpowder. He boasted that one of his men was worth 100 island warriors. Lapu basically said, let me at him, and challenged him to a battle. One morning on the island of Mactan, Magellan landed with a crew of only 16 soldiers. Why so few, you might add? At this point, Magellan really did, I think, begin to lose his sense of balance, certainly his common sense, and he figured this would be enough to defeat whatever island force Lapu would be able to rally. But in fact, he was met by 1,500 enraged island warriors armed with poison-tipped bamboo spears and bamboo shields, and they eventually managed to defeat that very small band of European sailors. Pigafetta fought at Magellan's side and took a spear right in the forehead and spent a couple of weeks in bed afterwards, but managed to recover from this. But he was one of the very lucky ones. Magellan wasn't among the lucky ones. Once Lapu and his warriors identified him as the leader, they hacked him to bits. In fact, there was no part of Magellan left that was big enough for the Europeans to recover. And that was the end, and the very, very unnecessary end of perhaps the greatest explorer of the age of exploration. It's also a rather, I think, cautionary tale, and perhaps a classic tale of hubris. Anyway, I think my time is out, so I'll be happy to open the floor to questions from you. Thank you. Thanks.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Laurence Bergreen discussing Over the Edge of the World. I'm going to ask you the first question. I think, well, I know that you visited the Strait of Magellan during your research for the trip, and I really would like to hear what it was like for you and how it compares today to the time when Magellan discovered it.
Well, I retraced Magellan's route there over the course of a couple of weeks, having the benefit of scientific knowledge and cameras and a cruise ship and all of that. But the Strait of Magellan, which is really one of the great scenic wonders of the world, it's only 500 miles north of the Antarctic Circle, so it's very far south. Some of the worst weather in the world is to be found there. And even though I went under optimal conditions, which was early January, which of course was the peak of summer then, it was very, very stormy all the time. The cover of my book has a picture which I took from the deck of the ship, and that was on a good day, and you can see it looks pretty gloomy and menacing then. These were fjords, and the water was also frigid. If any of Magellan's sailors had fallen overboard, they would have only had 6 minutes or so to survive before being frozen to death. And in fact, many of them couldn't swim. In those days, most sailors didn't know how to swim and really disliked the water and avoided the water. But it's because I was seeing exactly what Magellan had seen 500 years ago, the blue glaciers and the intricate maritime maze. It was very, very useful in terms of recreating the kind of high point of his voyage.
You also talk in the book about the treasure fleet, which I know doesn't get discussed as often in the context of the whole book. Could you talk a little bit about the treasure fleet and
Sure.
Magellan's perception of it as they embarked on their journey?
Yeah. That's just a little bit of a longer answer, just by way of background. The treasure fleet of the Golden Dragon throne was a Chinese fleet 100 years or so before Magellan that was led by a Chinese admiral named Cheng Ho, who was a eunuch and was said to be 7 feet tall. And it was roughly speaking, the Chinese Columbus. That's really oversimplifying things. In some ways, he was the Chinese Columbus, Magellan, and Da Gama, and many other figures all rolled up into one. There were a number of the treasure fleet took a number of voyages over a period of time in ships that were marvels of the day. They were among the largest sailing ships ever built, as long as 500 feet. They had bulkheads. They knew how to prevent scurvy, which Magellan's sailors didn't. They were far more advanced than Western. I mean, Magellan's fleet was puny and ill-equipped by comparison. They were not out for conquest, except in a perhaps implicit way. They were really trading expeditions, and they circled a large part of the globe. There's a considerable debate about just how much. For trading opportunities for the Middle Kingdom, for the Chinese Empire. They were long gone by the time Magellan came on the scene, and as he began to enter waters that they had formerly visited or even controlled, he just came across relics without realizing what they were. We now know, with the benefit of hindsight, what they were, but he saw porcelain, he saw silk. These were artifacts, of course, of China, and he saw evidence of Chinese writing, which was used primarily for trade or business purposes, trade or business purposes, rather than, say, historical or fiction or legends or anything like that. He didn't really understand why or what he was seeing, but what he was seeing was the remnants of what had once been perhaps the most impressive fleet ever mounted. So that's a little bit about the treasure fleet.
And in your research, did you come up with any kind of a theory as to what happened?
What happened to the treasure fleet?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are 2 books that I would recommend about the subject. One is by Louise Lovathes, and the other one is by Gavin Menzies, which is a far more speculative work, and I think might be best taken with a grain of salt. But eventually, Cheng Ho died, and the emperor died, and the Confucians took over from the eunuchs, these two warring factions, and they ordered all the fleet to be burned and brought an end to a very, in a way, atypical era of Chinese exploration, and China didn't embark on major expeditions after that. So that was the end of the Chinese fleet, and if it had still been in full bloom in when Magellan got there, world history might have been very different.
You're listening to Laurence Bergreen discussing Over the Edge of the World. The floor is now open to the audience.
Yes, outside of Piccafello, of the 18 survivors, do you have any interesting stories to tell after they came back from Europe?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Perhaps the most significant among them was Sebastian Elcano, who was a Basque mariner who emerged as the leader of the fleet after Magellan was killed. There had been considerable turmoil and a struggle for power after that. Elcano, who was not of the same, perhaps, caliber as Magellan, but was a very seasoned mariner, managed to lead that one ship called Victoria safely home, and he was the one who was accorded many of the honors and accolades that might have come to Magellan if Magellan had made it all the way around. Of course, the fact that Elcano was a Basque and therefore a separatist almost by definition posed special problems. But I think from the Spanish point of view, at least he wasn't Portuguese. At least he wasn't an enemy. And so, in fact, in Spain, this expedition is called the Elcano-Magellan expedition, or just the Elcano expedition, and Magellan's role is downplayed. However, Elcano wasn't really able to savor his victory very long because he was soon sent out on essentially a copycat expedition to go back to the Spice Islands, and he died of scurvy on the way. So that was, there are a number of tragic stories like that in the age of exploration. The other survivors tended to be not the big shots of the crew, not the officers or the astrologers, but the ordinary able-bodied seamen, the page boys and the cabin boys, who had somehow been far enough away from the heat of the action to have been, or just plain lucky enough to have made it all the way around.
You mentioned the mermaids and monsters and magnetic islands that were frequently included in
Yes.
the margins of the maps. I think
Yes.
it was in the book The Island of Lost Maps that it was suggested that they were in fact put there by the explorers who knew they weren't there, but to simply discourage others from venturing into spots that they wanted to keep as their own.
Well, that's interesting. That might be the case. I think a lot of these legends actually got their start from the Arab traders who wanted to cover their tracks concerning the spice route, and so they invented all sorts of demons and devils and monsters to make it seem as if it was impossible to get to the source of the spices. And they were very effective doing that. But clearly the source of many of these other myths were some of the most widely regarded works of antiquity. Pliny, for example, being one example. And then there was Sir John Mandeville, who wrote a famous and highly entertaining compilation of ancient myths, tempered with what he said were observations of his own, which again sort of reinforced the idea that there were all sorts of demons and monsters and people who, could wrap their ears around their heads and, all sorts of bizarre things out there.
If I may, also, you mentioned the cultures he encountered were pre-literate. Is there any oral tradition among the cultures he encountered that may have some recollection passed down over time?
None that I was able to come across. Nothing really that has historians been able to find in connection with Magellan.
Captain Cook brought with him in his expeditions the Pacific doctors. And I wanted to know if Magellan expedition had some medicine men or if there was any concern when they had these orgies or these, very close encounters with natives, with all different genetic background, if there was any consideration at that time, just, plain hygienic.
Well, in terms of their medicine, it was really what we would call today folk medicine. It was very primitive. The closest approach to a doctor on board the ships was the barber, Hernando Bustamante, who was a barber/surgeon, and his main job was trimming beards and pulling painful teeth. If somebody really had a serious medical problem, they were basically out of luck. Many of the men suffered terribly. In my book, I actually list the contents of the, quote, medical chest, unquote, that Bustamante brought along with him, and it's as you'll see, very, very primitive in the extreme.
Just have a couple of basic questions. You talked about the Chinese ships in the treasure fleet.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what the ships that Magellan took were like in terms of their seaworthiness or lack of it and state of the art? And then just a quick thing of if you could just tell the route that they took to get down to what's now the Strait of Magellan and then back again. Thank you.
Right. They were known as caravels, and this was a design that was a hybrid design, partly European in inspiration and partly Arab. It had been pioneered by Prince Henry the Navigator way before Magellan, and they were able to sail fairly close to the wind. By European standards, they were fairly maneuverable, which made the expedition possible. I think that the ships, however, from what we know about them, we don't know that much. because we don't have any pictures of the actual ships, were rather flimsy. There's a great deal of talk about about repairing them, concern about termites. In fact, termites claimed one of the ships on the voyage, which had to be burned. And apparently they were fairly flimsy. They were just ordinary ships that the backers of the expedition, the Fugger family of Germany, essentially rented for this expedition, and they were not specially equipped for any particular rigors or anything like it. Yes?
I had a couple questions. I was wondering how long it took you to write the book, to the material, to prepare for it and write it.
Oh, that's a good question. I've been thinking about a subject like this for about 20 years, but could never quite get the right one. And then once I finally settled on Magellan, it was a little bit quicker. So it was about 3.5 years of more or less constant work.
And I had one other question. I was curious, at the time of Magellan, did the Europeans know about going to the Spice Islands by going south around the African coast at that time?
Some navigators believed it could be done, but of course Cape Horn is so hazardous that it was also believed to be, probably a fatal exercise. So there was great urgency about somehow finding a shortcut, the Strait of Magellan as it turned out, to avoid that exigency. And but even that, because it was so far south, wasn't quite as good as what Magellan had promised King Charles. And in fact, it was about 60 years later before anyone else, and that was, of course, Sir Francis Drake, was able to circumnavigate the world. Again, Drake more or less followed Magellan's path. He went through the Strait of Magellan. There was some significant differences in his route. But it turned out to be more difficult than anyone had imagined at the time.
Two questions. One on spices.
Yes.
It's a big category.
Yeah.
Can you share with us if there were any preferential spices?
Oh, sure.
Were certain spices worth a great
Yes.
deal more than
Yes.
others for their
Yes.
characteristics?
There was a big five, and the most valuable of all was cloves, believe it or not, simple cloves, which grew on short trees, on Ternate and Tudor, which had a climate that was very moist, 100 inches of rainfall a year. They were also volcanic islands, so they were growing in volcanic soil. Nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and pepper. Now, pepper grew in a number of places, and cinnamon also grew on other islands. And Magellan's fleet passed cinnamon along the way, and they were very tempted to start collecting it and loading it on board their ships, but they really wanted to save space for cloves, which were the most valuable of all. You may ask, well, why didn't they just bring back some plants or trees to Spain and cultivate them there? And that experiment was tried, but not successfully. There's a story, which I repeated in the book, that one of the local rulers of the Spice Islands said at the time, well, you can take our plants if you want, but you won't be able to take our climate. And in fact, agriculture wasn't nearly as well understood in those days, and Europe was probably a lot colder in those days because it was the Little Ice Age, as many climatologists now believe. So it was difficult to grow the spices.
The second question relates to disease. I can't help but think that close encounters of those kinds didn't lead to the transfer of a lot of diseases,
Yeah.
Social and others. And were there any reports as to perhaps devastating sicknesses that may have followed the expedition, in the wake of the expedition,
That's
from
a
European
really
diseases?
provocative question, and to my knowledge, there were no reports of disease, social or otherwise, following in Magellan's wake. Magellan's men suffered themselves from scurvy at one point near the end of the voyage. Some of the survivors passed among some islands, and they were convinced that the inhabitants were suffering from venereal disease, and they were truly abhorred. They had a true abhorrence of venereal disease. They may have been seeing people who were suffering from leprosy. We're not really sure what they saw. But they seemed to be fairly careful about venereal disease. That was one of the few things that they were relatively careful about. But as far as we know, we don't think that Magellan's men actually went around spreading diseases in the way perhaps analogous to the ones described by Jared Diamond in his book. Yes.
I'm very interested in the navigational aids which were used, and if you could describe them. And also, I wonder, were they really sufficient for the task that he wanted them to do, or were they, that last ship, was it just lucky to get back? Did they have a lot of problems because the navigational aids weren't sufficient to really do the job?
It was very primitive. They had sextants and they had compasses. And they had fairly reliable maps known as Portolan charts, which were charts of harbors based on actual empirical evidence that served them well close to home. But after a while, their maps, of course, were no good or wildly inaccurate. Magellan's men, of course, they could. This is well before the era of being able to determine longitude. Magellan's men could determine latitude, we think within a degree or two, but they also suffered under the dangerous illusion that they could, in fact, fix longitude, which meant that they often misplaced themselves on the globe and didn't even know how big the globe was. So there were so many layers of misconceptions and misunderstandings about what they were doing that there was considerable debate during most of the voyage about, in fact, where they were. This had some tremendous implications because, as I mentioned just at the very beginning of my book, Pope Alexander VI had actually divided the world in half into two spheres of influence, a Portuguese sphere and a Spanish sphere. And the Spanish, of course, wanted to demonstrate that the Spice Islands lay within their sphere. And nobody really knew for sure in whose sphere they did lay because of this, because of all these navigational problems. So they were not adequate to the task. In fact, once their maps ran out and they were in the Pacific Ocean, they simply resorted to capturing local pilots, mainly Arabs, and saying to them under threat of death, take us to the Spice Islands or else. So that was often how they accomplished navigation.
A couple of questions. One, just to build on your last point, I mean, you think of the Treaty of Tordesillas as drawing a line in the Western Hemisphere,
yes,
which is why Brazil is Portuguese.
Right, that's the line of demarcation I mentioned
but
earlier.
If they didn't have a clear idea of the world being round, how would the Pope's line have applied in the East? Or, put the question a different way, after Magellan's trip returned, did that confirm that the Spice Islands lay in the Spanish zone or not? Ultimately, of course, Spain occupied the Philippines, but not the actual Spice Islands.
It wasn't clear to me, and I think it wasn't clear to many people, if the line of demarcation was intended to continue around the other half of the globe, because nobody really knew what was there or what it would have been separating. For starters, also, the line was moved several times after it was first laid down or in some way indicated in order to accommodate Portuguese protests and then later on Spanish influence. In other words, it became a kind of a line in the sand or a line in the water because it moved several times, and because of the problems in fixing in determining latitude, it was also very difficult to say exactly where the line was. Now, Magellan's astrologers, and I sort of hyphenate that term because those were the roles that the mathematicians filled, astrology being considered part. And astrology and astronomy were all sort of lumped together and were considered equally valid disciplines. Discovered to their dismay that despite what they had promised King Charles, that the Spice Islands were likely in the Portuguese sphere, which posed big problems because they were proving exactly the opposite of what they had, set out to demonstrate. And so there's some evidence that they may actually have falsified their navigational records to try and push the Spice Islands over into the Spanish sphere.
Another question is a bit more speculative, but given how valuable the Spice Islands were, if Magellan had not made the voyage at all, or let's say hadn't gotten the backing when he did, were there other explorers of that general era who might well have tried? Was he the first person to come up with an idea that probably would have crystallized, or was it really an almost unique concept on his part to try and circumnavigate the globe?
It was an idea that was in the air. Europeans were trying to find a way, especially Spain and Portugal, which were the two greatest sea powers at the time, to do this end run around the Portuguese monopoly. And We don't really know exactly which other people might have come up with it, because they were probably Portuguese, and the Portuguese were very, very secretive about their exploration. There are voyages that went out that we know little or nothing about. In fact, if Magellan had sailed for his native country, for Portugal, we might have known little or even nothing about this first ever circumnavigation of the globe. After Magellan tried to do it, the idea became all the rage, and King Charles, who later became King Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, nearly went bankrupt trying to duplicate that feat. In fact, he never managed to do it, and at the end of the day, finally got so deeply into debt, said to hell with it, and sold his claim to the Spice Islands back to the Portuguese for a great deal of money, in fact, enough to get him out of debt. So they became a political football. Yes, sir.
On the subject of drawing lines, I gathered from your book and elsewhere that the need for the international date line was discovered experimentally by the people on that ship, and that they were much puzzled at first when they got back to civilization and found their log was a day out of date.
Right.
Is it known who has the honor of having figured that out and how long it took?
Oh, I think that the discovery belongs collectively to the 18 survivors, who all discovered they were a day off when they got back. They heard this to their shock and dismay all at once, partly motivated by religious concerns, because they realized they might have celebrated Easter, an Easter Mass on the wrong day. And of course, on Friday, when they weren't supposed to eat meat, they might have been eating meat. And, to them, this was a very serious matter. So they were very concerned about it.
What I meant was, who figured out why?
Oh, who figured out? Well, I really don't know the answer to that question. Yes.
In the beginning of the book, it seemed like the Spanish were very enlightened about the way to treat people that they met from other lands. And somehow, as I was reading, Magellan seems to have gotten meaner and darker until he went into this frenzy of conversion at the end. Do you have any ideas about what sort of pushed him in that direction? And does it have something to do with, you said you'd like to talk a little bit about orgies. So I'd throw out that if you wanted to talk about that also.
Did Magellan he certainly became more caught up with a sense of his own power and omnipotence as the voyage went on. He was, and by many standards, a very, very effective leader, and didn't go around killing people wantonly, just for the thrill of it. But he was clearly taken with the idea of how powerful he could be, and this was amplified tremendously by his sense that God was on his side and would justify and vindicate all his actions. It seemed to me as I was writing the book that his behavior and tracking his behavior, and this is based really on the evidence that we have of his actions rather than any statements he made, that he became more and more caught up with this grandiose view of himself and changed the nature of the voyage from a commercial voyage to a ill-advised spiritual quest. His sailing orders were very, very clear. He was supposed to go to the Spice Islands and bring back spices to Seville. That's really the whole voyage in a nutshell. There was nothing about converting as many islanders or non-Christians as he could find. And in fact, after he embarked on these conversions, he was advised or counseled by a number of the officers serving under him that he was getting off the subject and they should just keep sailing on. And although they were having a lot of excitement, conducting these ceremonies, baptismal ceremonies, they were there to go to the Spice Islands. So Magellan did seem to change and transform, especially when he got into the Pacific and eventually paid the ultimate price for it. In terms of his being Portuguese, I'm not exactly sure how his being, Portuguese would play into that. But as the Portuguese at that time there was a very fatalistic strain in sort of Portuguese thinking and mythology, and it's possible that Magellan felt himself in the shadow or in the grip of something larger than himself. But there's really nothing that we know of anything he said or wrote that would lend credence to that. That's just speculation. Yes.
I guess you're saying it was all about spices and exploiting the botany of these different geographies, but to what extent was Magellan at all a cultural anthropologist? I mean, was he fascinated by any of the customs of these indigenous peoples that he encountered? And maybe you could connect that to the question about orgies.
There was no... By the way, it doesn't look as though he participated in these orgies. Of all the numerous records of the voyage that we have, no one even suggests that he was among those. He seems to have shown superhuman self-control by abstaining. But in terms of how he regarded the indigenous peoples, he really was fairly focused in terms of what he could get from them in terms of obtaining his goals. And that was about as far as it went. It was Pigafetta, his chronicler, the Renaissance man, who was actually genuinely interested in their languages and their customs, wrote at great length about them, was, before there was a term, such a term, an ethnographer or anthropologist. In fact, he wrote down phrase books, simple lexicographies of their languages, of these pre-literate languages, both in South America and the Pacific, which are part of his account of the voyage. In many cases, this is our Europeans' first sense of what these other languages would be like. And he would do this in a very simple way. He described how he did it. He would sit down with an indigenous some of them were called giants because they were very tall. Some of them were called Indians, and asked them of the name for the moon and the stars and the sun and parts of bodies and numbers, and then various concepts like God or devils or things like that, and simply wrote down the equivalents. Now, when he was writing this down, he also records how astonished the indigenous people to whom he was talking were by the fact that this writing would somehow let him repeat or replicate what they had said, because this was the first time they really became aware of the power of writing. It seemed to me, looking back on this 500 years later, that although Magellan believed that the most powerful thing that he brought with him on the voyage was gunpowder and weapons, that actually it was the written word that was the most powerful thing that the Europeans brought with them without even realizing it.
I'm about two-thirds of the way through your book. I was hoping you could jump ahead a little bit and just tell me your impression on what impact you think his voyage had on the economics and the political situation of that time and in the near future generations.
Well, it was not as great as you'd think, because Magellan's became a bit of an unperson both in Spain and Portugal, and although King Charles tried to follow up on Magellan's voyage, he was unsuccessful in doing so. And in fact, the idea of the iconic and heroic Magellan that we all began hearing about in third grade or shortly thereafter was one that was really manufactured by the English. And they were the ones who really picked up the standard of Magellan, and it happened about 30 or 40 years after the voyage was completed, when a translation of Pigafetta's memoirs by Richard Eden, this was an abridged translation, appeared in England and became very, very popular. And you may wonder, well, why in England, which at that point was a second-rate sea power that was aspiring to become a first-rate sea power? And that was exactly why. He became he was used by many pamphleteers and supporters of England's nascent imperial ambitions as an example of what the kind of role that they should be emulating. They should follow Magellan's courageous model in conquering the seas and gaining control of the seas, not so incidentally for England and for Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism. So that's really where he became known as a heroic figure. And this tradition of treating Magellan as a kind of heroic navigator among English language historians has continued right down almost to our own times. He's regarded as a much more questionable and darker figure by many Spanish and Portuguese and French historians. Yes.
What exactly did he take along in his cargo, both for use on the ship and to trade for these spices?
Well, we actually know virtually everything he did take along because the records are so detailed. So we know about the sails, we know about the rope, we know about the wine. We even know where the wine casks were stored on the ships. We know about the fish hooks. We know about the food right down to the last raisin and garbanzo bean and all the dried pork and dried salt fish. And it was all mostly very salty food and the hardtack. But when you think of the immensity of what they were going to do and how long it would take them, the kinds of supplies they brought with them were actually quite simple, especially by modern standards. Living conditions aboard these ships, which we think were about 90 to 100 feet long, were so simple that men didn't even sleep on hammocks. That was an innovation which came along somewhat later in the age of discovery. In those days, when there was time to grab a little sleep on a ship, they simply lay down on a plank somewhere, either on deck or below deck, and if they had a coat with them, they might lie on that. If there was some straw, they could fashion themselves a pallet. But living conditions were very, very simple, nor was there a proper galley on these ships. There wasn't even a cook on these ships. So the men took turns cooking for one another. We're not really sure why there wasn't a cook on the ships. There's some speculation that since the food was so awful, anybody who was the cook would immediately become the subject of tremendous criticism, and so they just kept shifting the burden around. There's also as I mentioned, medicine was also very, very primitive on these ships. One of the things that really struck me and actually puzzled me after I went through the Strait of Magellan myself in January of 2002 was how the men managed to survive the extreme cold, especially when they didn't have time to stop and tie up and build a fire either on the ships or on land. We know that they brought warm clothing with them. Presumably it got soaked through. We also know that they slaughtered seals and used their pelts for warmth. But even taking those precautions, it was so cold in the best weather of the year when I was through there. It seemed really astonishing to me that anybody could survive that. I also wrote in the book about one of the ships becoming being driven, being sent out on a reconnaissance expedition. This was Santiago, being driven onto the rocks. All the men, by a miracle, surviving, but then having to make their way back to base camp, if you will, over snow and ice covered mountains over a period of several weeks, and how they managed to survive that ordeal. We know they did. Also, escapes me how they actually managed to do it without benefit of fire and things like that.
And what did it take to trade in the Spice Islands?
They took a variety of things. They took a lot of trinkets. They took bolts of cloth. They took velvet. They took red caps. Most sailors wore dark blue or black caps. They took red caps. They took little mirrors. Occasionally they took Bibles or prayer books with them to use for trade. But they brought many objects like that. They also brought a great deal of Venetian glass baubles and trinkets with them to use for trade. Anything that was sort of shiny and looked metallic. They knew from other expeditions that indigenous peoples highly prized metal and that they could purchase a great deal of goodwill and food and whatever else they needed with anything that was metal. They brought simple German knives with them. They brought hatchets with them. And these were all used for trading purposes. And in fact, it took almost the entire 3 years for them to exhaust their store of those items that they brought specifically to trade.
Outside of Magellan, how would you rate the top 5 explorers and why?
I'm not sure my opinion on that is all that worthwhile and certainly not definitive. But because Columbus was Magellan's inspiration, I think he would have to be up there. Because Balboa was the first to actually see the Pacific, although I didn't realize how immense that body of water is, the largest body of water on the planet, he would have to be up there. If we're talking about land explorers as well as sea explorers, then we'd have to go back a couple of hundred years and, of course, include Marco Polo in their number. But I think this is the kind of question that, people can have a lot of fun sitting around thinking, who would belong in the top 5. And I think if we were sitting here in England, we would probably include Drake among the top 5 because he's considered a great, almost folk hero in England. If we were in Spain, we would probably have a different list. Yes, sir.
This is a wonderful, wonderful evening, and you've told the story beautifully. It's absolutely delightful to hear you talk. Has television approached you for rights to this? I mean, you must. Somebody must want it. Or
yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about it, and that's something I actually really try and stay out of, because. But there has been a lot of discussion about television or movie adaptations about the story. It is a big story, and it covers a lot of ground. In fact, it covers the whole world, and it's 500 years ago. So I think from the standpoint of view of trying to recreate this for cameras, that it poses a lot of challenges.
It's so wonderful to hear. We've had Shackleton just recently, and Lewis and Clark, and we've had all these wonderful stories about these explorers. They're just fascinating. I was trying to think historically. I don't know enough about the dates, but Cortez had already conquered Mexico and South America.
That's right.
You mentioned Rio,
yes.
San Diego. Now, when they got around to the West Coast, was Lima a city already, and did they stop at any Spanish ports?
When you say they, who do you mean?
Magellan.
Oh, no, Lima was not a city, and when I occasionally mention cities that they passed in my book, what I meant to say, and I hope it's clear, that this is where the future Valparaiso or Lima might be located. But at that time, that area was inhabited only by various Indian tribes, and there were Portuguese settlements there, but they were often abandoned because the Portuguese were very, very short of manpower and weren't able to man these outposts of their empire, which soon began to fall apart.
Because certainly the Spanish had gotten all the way down the east and west coast very quickly.
Yes.
After Cortez. Balboa, what day was he? Because he brought back reports of Pacific, right? When he crossed.
That's right. He sighted the Pacific, without realizing it was thought that the Pacific might be a gulf. And might be able to be crossed in a few days or perhaps a few weeks, and no one guessed how big it was, and that it would take you have to go another 9,000 miles before you got to China.
That's a wonderful story.
Thank you.
Again, 2 questions. Could you quickly say what the route that they did take?
Well, it's kind of harder there's a map in my book which will give, there is the route. But roughly speaking, when they left for Seville, they were always sailing west. They made a landfall a little bit north of Rio de Janeiro. Then they sailed along the coast of South America, very far south until they reached the Strait of Magellan, navigated that, then emerged into the Pacific at the western mouth of the strait, then began to head north very rapidly because Magellan was very eager to get out of the low latitudes, which were so stormy. Once he reached higher latitudes, he hit the trades without realizing what they were. In fact, they didn't have a name at that point, but we know from Pigafetta that once they set the sails, they didn't have to move them for 3 weeks, which was really extraordinary. And of course, they made very rapid progress. It's been estimated that the ships at their maximum were able to make as much as 6 or 8 knots, but we're not really sure about that. And then their first landfall, when they were crossing the Pacific, came after 98 days. That was the island of Guam. And once they reached Guam and recovered, well, they had some skirmishes with the islanders there. They kept on sailing east until they got close, but oddly enough, the closer and closer to Indonesia they became, the more confused and muddled they became about which direction they were going. And in fact, they began to lose their way. If you look at the map, this was partly because Magellan wasn't there to guide them with his iron hand, and partly because they were listening to the last Arab pilot that they would capture, and some of them gave them good advice, and some of them misdirected the fleet about which direction they would go. After this, am I running out of time? No. Okay. After the Spice Islands, once again they kept on sailing east, they were now down to 2 ships. One ship, under the command of the military MP, the MP basically, who was not really an experienced captain, tried to retrace their route back to Spain because he was sailing against the trade winds, wound up getting hopelessly lost, sailing very far north of his goal, and then sailing south again and being captured by the Portuguese and humiliated and imprisoned. The other ship, under the command of Elcano, kept on going. They had to round the Cape of Good Hope, which is described in very, very graphic detail about Pigafetta. Although there's some question as to how accurate Pigafetta's account was, the thought is that he might have been so incapacitated or addled by that point that he really wasn't thinking clearly or writing clearly. After that, I'm tempted to say the rest of the voyage, which was simply sailing north up the western coast of West Africa, up to Spain, was a piece of cake, and it was in the sense that they were then back in waters that had been explored and mapped before. And the closer they got to Spain, the closer they were, the more and more familiar the landmarks became.
I just wanted to interject to follow up, since you were asking, at what point did Magellan perish, and in terms of like the duration of the journey, and how long was it after that they had to navigate back?
A little more than halfway through the journey. That was when Magellan was killed in the island of Mactan. So it was about a little more than a year and a half. The captains had seen it coming, in the sense that they felt that Magellan's behavior was becoming so reckless that he was liable to bring this on himself. So they were actually prepared in advance to take over with 2 captains, one Spanish and one Portuguese, in the event of his death, which is exactly what happened. Now, they weren't able to maintain their command very long, but in the short run, at any rate, they were prepared for this eventuality. As I said, Magellan really didn't enjoy much trust or confidence among his crew or captains, Pigafetta being a very notable exception. He really revered Magellan, and he's part of the reason that the British wound up idolizing or seeing Magellan as a very important figure, because they took their lead from Pigafetta. If they had read, say, Portuguese court historians writing about the voyage, they would have seen that Magellan was told to do what he did by the devil and was carrying out the devil's orders. So it depended on which account you were relying to get an impression of Magellan.
Building on what one of the gentlemen had asked about the accounts of Shackleton's voyage, yes, and the other Lewis and Clark. As an historian, why do you think now there seems to be more of an interest or a lot more activity in writing about the age of exploration?
I'm not really sure. I think we do live in a new age of discovery, but it's the discovery of the solar system. And I also think we're now much more aware than we used to be of the clash of civilizations on this planet, and that's perhaps sensitized us to some of the issues that were at stake 500 years ago. But I'm not really sure. This was just, for me personally, my approach to subjects is probably more intuitive than logical, and as I'd mentioned, it was an idea that I'd thought about for a couple of decades before I finally realized that Magellan just was somehow the right door to go through to be able to write a story that would be exciting and perhaps recover a lot of knowledge that had been, if not lost, then at least neglected for a long time.
I, as a child, remember Herbert Zim's books as sort of enlightening. Mm-hmm. How does Vasco da Gama fit in the trade at the time?
Well, he was a very important. I'm not really a da Gama expert by anybody's, any stretch of the imagination. He was an important Portuguese explorer, and I think Magellan would love to have attained the respectability that da Gama eventually managed to obtain for himself. but of course he never did. One of the things I've often thought about, and it's fascinating speculation, is what would have happened if Magellan had survived and made it back? Would he have been given a hero's welcome? I actually don't think so. He was in so much hot water because of all these accusations of torture that the Spanish would almost certainly have subjected him to some kind of trial and imprisonment, and that wasn't unusual in that era for explorers who were returning home. He might have been captured by the Portuguese. One of the things I didn't get a chance to mention in my opening remarks was that almost from the moment that Magellan set out, the Portuguese sent 2 fast ships to try and catch him. And they embarked on a round-the-world chase to try and catch up with Magellan's fleet. And if they had caught up with him, at the very least, they would have dragged him back to Portugal in chains. Probably worse. We know that when they did catch up finally with the remnants of his fleet a couple of years later, they treated the men mercilessly and essentially left them to die in the tropical heat. So you can only imagine what they would have done with a traitor like Magellan.
Was there anything else in the cross-cultural commerce, such as tea or tobacco, cocoa maybe?
Well, I don't know. There might have been, but this was a mission, an expedition that was focused solely on obtaining spices.
A related question to what he just asked. I was wondering if in any of the accounts there was any mention of any foods that they may have encountered. In other words, did they discover coconuts, or did they come across? Yeah,
Pigafetta loved coconuts and wrote at great length about them, and was fascinated by the many uses to which the islanders put them, both for brewing palm wine, which the sailors got drunk on, and making some kind of a butter, and of course just the milk of the coconut and the uses of the leaves, and he was fascinated by that. And he actually includes some fairly detailed recipes, especially when the food they encounter gets more palatable the closer they get to China, of what sound like some delectable, very tasty chicken and pork and beef dishes that they encountered after, months of eating the most vile food imaginable. When I say vile, they were eating hardtack, which was these very hard biscuits, which, as Pigafetta tells us, had been fouled by the urine of rats aboard the ship, as well as their feces, and they were reduced to eating this. And when they ran out of that hardtack, they stripped the leather that covered the masts to protect them from chafing, boiled the leather, and chewed on that. One of the myths, although it turns out not to be a myth among the sailors, was that eating rats, and there were plenty of rats aboard these ships, would protect them from scurvy, which of course was the dread sailor's disease. And so they sold rats for a fairly high price. Pigafetta says a ducat apiece. I'm not sure what he meant by a ducat, but it sounds like they were fairly expensive. And it turns out that rats, unlike humans, do synthesize vitamin C in their bodies, and presumably if you eat a rat, you can protect yourself against vitamin C. Oh, but one more thing about food I've got to mention, because it was so interesting. Magellan never suffered from scurvy, nor did his officers. And they wondered why, and they didn't know. The reason why was because they brought quince with them. Quince paste, quince jam, which is a Spanish delicacy, which maybe some of you have had. It's really delicious, and it's made from little tiny sour apples, and of course it's very rich in vitamin C, which prevents scurvy. So Magellan and his officers, who were helping themselves to this delicacy, were protecting themselves against vitamin C all along without realizing it. Now, if Magellan had known that he had a sovereign cure for scurvy with him on board the ship, he would have, of course, insisted, in fact, knowing Magellan, he would have made it an order punishable, on pain of death, that all the men had their daily ration of quince. But they didn't know that, and they didn't know why they weren't suffering while the ordinary seamen were.
So it seems from what you're saying, since recipes were mentioned, that they were actually trying different foods.
Yes, they were. Certainly Pigafetta was. I mean, he was not the average sailor. He was a far more refined and educated and multilingual and curious person than, your average seaman who might have been revolted by some of these things. But Pigafetta was curious about everything. That's why I call him a Renaissance man, and that's why we're very lucky to have his account.
were there accounts of unusual birds or plants or flowers?
Yes, yes, there are, but we don't really have detailed drawings. Pigafetta drew some very simple, really cartoons of some of these islands. We don't have, the kinds of botanical drawings that we'd like to have, and his descriptions tend to be very, very general, so we're often not sure what he's talking about. For example, he talks about these black and white ducks in the Strait of Magellan that he'd never seen before. What he really means, of course, is penguins, which are now called Magellanic penguins. So he gives us rather vague descriptions of what he sees, and there's been a lot of guesswork about what he actually meant, and in a few cases people have been able to really nail it down, so we can somehow, tease out more or embellish his account with modern scientific knowledge.
Thank you.
You mentioned that Magellan wasn't much trusted, and I was wondering, in very specific terms, what language did they speak on board?
Good
and then,
question.
More generally, what motivated both the crew and the officers to sail with him, and what authority or claims of authority was he able to make in order to keep this whole enterprise going, since it clearly wasn't a national project for any one country or sovereign?
Oh, it was a national project for Spain, and there was tremendous prestige involved sailing for the King of Spain. And he made sure to put in as many of his cronies as he could. It was the custom at that time to appoint captains who really didn't have any maritime experience, but they were important somebodies, and they were well connected. The language they used, and that's a very interesting question that you brought up, was complicated. It was probably nautical Castilian, which was a simple patois or argot that comprised all the nautical terms that they used. Probably somewhat simpler than the vast array of British nautical terms that we sometimes get inundated with today. But that was the lingua franca among the men. Magellan was very shy about his bad Spanish. We have a few accounts that mention that he felt awkward that he had such a strong Portuguese accent, and he often asked somebody to speak for him in clear Spanish, or some clear Spanish dialect, rather than rely on his own rather halting Spanish. But there was also a very significant Portuguese contingent among the crew, so he talked with them, of course, in Portuguese, but he tended to convey his wishes through written orders, so that there was no ambiguity about his intentions, rather than relying on speaking.
Were there any sort of national subgroups within the crew, based on language or religion?
Yes, there were. There were, of course, the officers who mainly spoke Castilian, and they considered themselves the real Spaniards. There were the Portuguese, many of whom were cronies or even relatives of Magellan. Nepotism was very, very common at that time in all levels of bureaucracy. There were the Basques, and they had a long-standing maritime tradition as Basque whalers. So that was another sort of linguistic affinity group or cluster, if you will. There were also a few Germans, a few French, a few Greeks, and many others. We actually have a list of every name on the roster of the ship and how much that individual was paid, including a few saints. And you may wonder, well, what were they doing on the roster? This was by no means a company of saints, but since every person was entitled to a share of the proceeds of the expedition, if it was successful, this was a way of donating some money to the church. So it was a convention to include a few phantoms, if you will, or saints among the roster of the crew members.
Question. Talk a little bit about the economics of this and the politics and the intersection. And there's a lot of money at stake here.
Yes.
How was that money at stake? You mentioned that the king and the backers were going to be enriched by this, but unless there was a very clear channel to the islands, to the Spice Islands, how did that work? And also talk a little bit about the politics before Magellan left. I mean, he was pretty much set up from the beginning to fail on many levels. You mentioned in the book that there were forces at work on the Spanish side as well as the Portuguese side to make sure that he failed, that mutinies may have been planned at the outset, and not to mention the fact that the Portuguese sent 2 ships to kill him or bring him back from the very beginning. So if you could talk maybe just a little bit about those 2 things.
Well, the first one was the commercial setup of it, and Then we'll go back to the second one. It has a lot of modern resonance. The backers, as I mentioned earlier, were the Fugger family, F-U-G-G-E-R, historically based in Augsburg, Germany. And they bankrolled a lot of voyages of discovery during the Age of Exploration. And in fact, they bankrolled a lot of the thrones of Europe. They lent money to King Charles to back this expedition at 14% interest, a very high interest rate, but it was a very high-risk voyage. It was thought that the likelihood of success was perhaps 1 in 5. So that's part of the reason why the interest rate was so high. King Charles, it's believed, according to the most reliable records, kicked in about 25% of the backing for the voyage. But even that money might have been lent to him or to the crown. So his real contribution to it might have been even smaller. Now, it's interesting to note that when that first ship got back of mutineers, the people who had the first crack at it were the agents of the bankers, not King Charles and not agents of the crown or anyone else. And the bankers picked it clean, the bankers' agents, I should say, picked it clean, looking for something valuable to begin to get some of their investment back. And that was the same thing that happened to the survivors of the voyage in that one ship, Victoria, when it finally made it back about 3 years after leaving. The amount of cloves was weighed with great care. There were some discrepancies found. Elcano, who was the captain who emerged after Magellan, was actually questioned. Before he got any awards or medals or honors or anything like that, he had to undergo a kind of an ordeal of questioning. Why was there a discrepancy? Why was the weight of the cloves less than what was on the manifest at the time the ship returned? He explained, I think, with pretty compelling logic, that they had simply dried out during the voyage and therefore lost some of their weight. But of course the suspicion was that he or some of those 18 crew members or some other mutineers had somehow stolen some of the cloves, very valuable cloves for themselves. When King Charles finally did get a hold of his cut, he was delighted and felt vindicated, and we have a letter that he wrote to, he was a Habsburg, that he wrote to one of his relatives in Holland, which was the center of the spice trade, in the sense that these were the spices were actually cleared and sold, boasting of his accomplishment in bringing back these very valuable spices. And there's a very kind of boyish sort of boastfulness about this. So anyway, that's my attempt to answer your first part of the question. Can you refresh my memory about the second part?
Talking about Magellan sort of being set up to fail.
Yeah, he was indeed, and you almost wonder why he went, because the deck did seem so much stacked against him. The chief culprit, or the leader of the anti-Magellan contingent, was Juan de Cartagena, who probably had never been to sea before, and who in the minds of some, including his own mind, was actually the co-admiral of the fleet, the co-captain general. He certainly considered himself that, and he was actually paid more. His salary was higher than Magellan's. And you may wonder, why is this amateur, this well-connected amateur, given such an august position? And the reason is because he was very well connected. The belief is that he was the illegitimate or natural son of the very powerful Archbishop Fonseca, who managed expeditions on behalf of the Spanish crown going back to the time of Columbus, who was a famously unpleasant man. Columbus disliked him. They had many disputes, and he was a very controlling, tight-fisted bureaucrat. And Magellan was very jealous of the power or the potential power of explorers like Columbus or Magellan. Did everything he could to clip their wings. His attempt to clip Magellan's wings was to put his own man, probably his nephew or his son, probably his son, on the ship with Magellan, and in some way to set him over Magellan as a kind of a official watchdog or guardian. But this was actually because this went to Cartagena's head. The first thing he did was lead a series of mutinies against Magellan. Magellan was afraid to challenge Cartagena directly. He was not among those who was tortured and beheaded in that gruesome way that I described, had so much fun describing earlier in the talk. He was given a little bit more subtle treatment. When they finally left the scene of the beheadings, that was Port St. Julian, which was not far from the Strait of Magellan, he and a priest who had been conspiring with him were marooned on a small island or a spit of land, and the ship simply sailed away and left them there, and they were never seen again. So that was the end of Cartagena and the priest who had conspired with him. When stories of this got back to Spain, and it was spread by some of the mutineers, that was considered at least as cruel and horrible as torturing the other mutineers.
We have time for one more question.
What happened to the men that did turn back initially? Were they still in jail when the final ship came in?
I think they're still in jail. What happened to them was once the surviving ship got back with a very different story about, this is the Elcano ship, the Victoria, of what happened. The Spanish authorities were then hopelessly befuddled. In the interest of just settling claims, declared a general amnesty and let almost everybody out of jail. And then, of course, that gave rise to a series of lawsuits as these sailors or the widows of sailors who hadn't returned began suing the Crown and suing anybody they could think of for the back pay they thought was due them, or proceeds of the voyage. If this all sounds very modern, it really is very modern.
Were any of the suits successful? Or?
Some of them were partially successful, and many of them came to nothing.
Thank you, Laurence Bergreen.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to Cambridge Forum, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, Harvard Bookstore, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this program entitled Over the Edge of the World, recorded in March 2004, send a check or money order for $12 to Cambridge Forum, 3 Church Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138, or visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Jamie Polya. Thank you for joining.